and then producing a Z stack and producing a 3D model. So that hasn't, those such high scale resolution images haven't been properly conducted in humans, but they have in other organisms. And that allows us to map the way that these 86 billion nerve cells are each connected to form the connectome. So within our brains, there's these 86 billion nerve cells. Each one's connected to about 10,000 other nerve cells to form about 100 trillion, 86 trillion connections within our mind, which can shift and change. And that's basically the root way which instructs how we think, how we process information from the outside world, and how it results in our behaviour and the way that we interact with the environment, whether it's physically moving things in the environment or whether it's communicating with other people in order to signal what we're processing. So what they're looking at isn't these high-resolution connections, the connectome of the baby, but they're looking earlier on how these nerve cells are starting to be laid down and constructed in that baby in the second half of its pregnancy.
Can they see the specific purpose of these various nerve cells? Again, if I compare it to an MRI, I might be looking at different parts of the brain that might deal with emotion or logic or fear. Are they able to identify what is being laid down and how?
Yeah, so they're looking at the major construction highways of the mind. So you're not looking at these scenic routes, right? You're looking at the major nerve cell tracks and how they're being laid down in that baby.
And what information will they yield? Again, how do they know what they're looking at and what its implications are?
Well, because of the way that we can now generate huge amounts of data and we have the computing capacity to store that information and then look for correlations and patterns and associations. They're looking at hundreds and hundreds of babies during this pregnancy process, and then they're able to follow up later on in life.
And see what X effects was, or what situation X, what the effect was later in life. Mm-hmm. You mentioned genes, and then you mentioned the anatomical signature earlier.
Yes.
And what is the connection between the gene and the anatomical signature in making these observations?
So at the moment, the research is focusing on these medical conditions, as I was mentioning earlier, but it will be extended to have a look at other aspects of human behaviour. So at the moment, we know that there is a strong correlation between genetic predisposition and certain behaviours, like, for example, autism has got a hereditary rate of around 80 to 90%, for example, or schizophrenia is thought to have a hereditary basis of about 70 to 80%. And we're not talking about one or two genes here, we're talking about hundreds of genes that are working in tandem. And generally speaking, these are genes that are linked to instructing how these nerve cells are laid down in the first place. They're called neurodevelopmental genes. So they're not genes that are involved in instructing how your little toe is put together, for example. They are genes that are involved in constructing your brain. So this makes sense, okay? So then you take these genes that are involved in these conditions and you have a look and see from the MRI imaging data and see whether there's any correlation between these genes, these genetic alterations that predispose you to these conditions, and how these highways in the mind are being constructed as you can see them from the images that are coming out of this baby. And then you start to see an association there, and then you start testing hypotheses about whether if you get one particular type of brain construction, does that also link to these genes?
Let's talk about how it can go beyond conditions that one might be inclined to inherit or likely to inherit, and or as we've discussed already, what one's food preferences might be based on these intergenerational experiences. Let's talk about the different personality and life impacts of this. It goes so wide. And could you track... Let's talk about romantic relationships, for example. The extent to which there are genetic prescriptions for whom we will look for, what we will look for. Could you explain what you've learned about that?
Yeah, so there's a chapter that's looking at friendship groups, and I'd quite like to talk about friendship groups as well, if that's okay. So there's a guy called Robin Dunbar who's based at Oxford University, and he's an anthropologist, and he's studied the size of the medial prefrontal cortex, so that's a region of the brain that's directly behind your forehead. And he's found that there's a correlation between the number of friends you might have and the size of this medial prefrontal cortex. And what he hypothesizes from all of this results, and he's been studying it for decades alongside other researchers across the world, and what he's hypothesizing is that, so there's some people in life who have a small number of friends, close friends, and they invest heavily in each one of those friends. They put a lot of time and effort into each one of those friends. Whereas there's other people in life that kind of have a large friendship group, and they invest less heavily in each one of those friends. Now, both types of people are very important, and you can see a different type of brain kind of anatomy, volume between those two types of people. So the first person ensures that there's this village, this supporting, nurturing village. And the second type of person skitters between each one of those little echo chambers, if you like, that little village.
Connectors.
They're the connectors, exactly. And when you look anatomically, what you find is that there's a different size in the medial prefrontal cortex, but you also see that there's a different receptor profile for something called beta endorphins. And it seems as though those people that kind of go and connect and allow information to filter between the different villages, the different smaller tribes, have a higher number of beta endorphin receptors. And so they're almost driven to go around and meet as many people as possible and help pass information from group to group.
Is it likely evolutionary, if we take the hypothesis a step further? Is
Yes.
it likely evolutionary?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Because we need to make our advanced societies work, evolution is going to determine X number of people with X number of qualities, X number of people with Y number of qualities. Is that too simplistic?
No, I think that makes complete and utter sense. Yeah, and that's exactly what Robin Dunbar argues.
You lost your thread. So that's the friendship groups, the connectors, and then the more intense...
supporters and
the
nurturers,
supporters,
yeah.
yeah. I mentioned the romantic... Let's talk about reproduction as much as
Yes.
romance, really, because the other assumption is always that with all its tremendous complications that many, many novels have been written about, there is a fundamental drive to connect, reproduce, and partner, and lots of debates about the driving dynamics of what people do and to respond to that. How much more sophisticated is what we are learning about those reproductive or romantic connections?
Well, in terms of reproduction particularly, there was one very entertaining study where they took a panel of ladies and they asked them to sniff a load of T-shirts. Now, the men, there was a long line of men who had been asked to wear these T-shirts for a couple of days and also to sleep in them. And the men were asked to not eat or do anything that's too smelly, too pongy, and not to put any deodorant on, for example, and then to take these T-shirts off. And the women went along and started smelling them and started rating how attractive they found these T-shirts to be. So they weren't seeing the men. There was literally no signal there apart from the olfactory stimulation, if you like. And what they found is that the women were rating the men's smell as more attractive if they had a much more diverse genetic diversity to them, particularly in relation to the immune system. And there's something called the MHC compatibility unit. So if there was a high diversity between the woman and the man in this MHC molecule, then they would more likely rate them as attractive. And it seems as though the women were subconsciously sniffing out their Mr. Right with immune strength in mind for any future offspring.
That's extraordinary.
Isn't it?
So you go for the tall, dark and handsome, I like the short, squat and blonde. Is that a different, that might be like a visual or whatever number or an emotional, whatever kind of preference going on there, but underpinning any preference that someone might have, or like, I like the extrovert, I like the introvert, I like the strong silent type. Whatever these superficial assumptions we have about what we're into, underlying this is a driver of get me the best immune system, or
for my baby,
get me the most genetic, or the most genetic diversity, or whatever. But in the specific study, that's the X factor. Is that the chemistry, perhaps?
That's the chemistry.
Finally, we worked out what the chemistry is.
It's all about immune system, and that seems quite relevant with everything that's going on in the world today. That we have this underlying subconscious biological driver to make future generations have a strong immune system.
They've also talked, I think, in a previous interview, actually, about brains and capacity for leadership or nature of leadership. Is that similar to the friendship group situation? I've thrown you on that.
I was just concentrating on the immune system and fighting off bugs.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My
sorry.
My mind was stuck on that, sorry.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary mind, by the way. So, again, can anatomy determine our capacity for leadership? Is that a similar concept to the friendship groups? People will have different roles or different strengths that actually may well have a genetic basis.
Well, there have been a few studies looking at the genetics of leadership capability. And so one of the most entertaining studies, is it entertaining? I don't know. But they were looking at a shoal of fish, zebrafish. So quite a lot of scientists look in fish when you're looking at social dynamics, how the fish decide to swim together and who takes that prime position at the front. And
5-2, 5-6.
Maybe 60 seconds.
5-6 coming. Bit better.
Thanks, mate. Thank you.
Got more?
No. It's all good. Coffee would be good.
sorry.
Right, I'm just waiting for Councillor Filipina, and I've got... Right, and Lydia on the way. Hey, whichever side gives balance. Talofalava, Maluelele, Kiorana, Morena, and thank you very much for coming along today. I'm joined today by the Honourable Carmel Cepoloni, who's the Acting Minister for Pacific Communities and is also a member of the Cabinet Committee on COVID-19. Just in time, I'm joined by Lamonga Lydia Sosene, the Chair of the Mangere Otahu Local Board. I've got Josephine Bartley, our Ward Councillor, and Al Filipina, our Ward Councillor, here today. It's with much regret that I announce today that we have made a decision to cancel Pacifica 2020. We have done so after really full consideration. We have discussed this with our Pacifica councillors and our local board chairs. We have discussed this with the Cabinet and the Prime Minister, and we have discussed it with other relevant people in the community, including the Samoan High Commissioner and the Samoan Consul General here in Auckland. Yesterday I had a phone call with the Prime Minister to discuss Pacifica, and again this morning, and also with Minister Cepoloni. We all expressed a desire for Pacifica to continue, but we had to weigh that desire against what might be perceived as a level of risk, not simply to the New Zealand community, but also to the community in the Pacific itself. Overnight, the Cabinet Committee on COVID-19 also discussed the issue, and its advice to Council was that they believed that the event should not proceed. The critical reason for that is not because health authorities have told us that there is a high risk of transmission of COVID-19 should Pacifica proceed. It is because should there be infection at Pacifica, there are hundreds of people coming to our festival from around the Pacific, and they will return to their homes. Weighing heavily on our minds was the history of the spread of infectious diseases in the Pacific, and most recently with measles last year in Samoa, with the taking of 82 lives, most of them young children. we were simply not prepared to take the risk that holding Pacifica might be responsible for that disease spreading into the Pacific, where the health systems and the resources are not sufficient to contain it in a way that we may be able to in this country, and that's really important. The cancellation of Pacifica this year, very sadly, comes for the second time running. Last year we did it because it followed immediately after the tragic events that took 51 lives at the mosques in Christchurch. Pacifica is a great event for us. It's a celebration of Tamaki Makoto's multiculturalism, and it's a celebration of the vibrant and really important Pacifica community in Auckland. In our city, we have the highest concentration of Pacifica people anywhere in the world. So we rate highly the importance of Pacifica, but notwithstanding that, we had to compare our enjoyment of that festival with the risk that this may, even if it was a small chance, that this may result in the spread of the infection into the Pacific. I want to stress, to conclude, that the risk of transmission of COVID-19 in Auckland and in New Zealand at the moment remains low. That is the advice that health authorities have given us. We had to weigh that against the advice that we also received from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And their concerns were very much as our concerns are with what the potential might be should infection arise and be transmitted back to the Pacific. And that is what has made our decision what it is at this particular point in time. This does not mean that all large gatherings of people will be cancelled across Auckland. We will continue to take the advice of health authorities on other major public events. We will continue, before taking any decision, to consult closely with the organisers of those events, and we will continue to take into account what is happening with COVID-19 in New Zealand. We are fortunate, through maybe good luck, but also very good management, to have constrained COVID-19 to 5 cases, all of them involving transmission within families and not into the wider community. But when I look at the figures for what has happened in Italy, France and Germany, which are advanced nations with strong resource bases and health systems, and I see the exponential rise in the spread of the disease in those countries once it takes hold in the community, then clearly, should the situation change in New Zealand, we will be implementing together with government and on the advice of health authorities even more stringent conditions on what events may be held in the future. I'd like at this stage to invite Minister Carmel Sepuloni to add anything that she thinks may be appropriate.
Thank you, Mayor Phil Goff. I think it's just important to state that we endorse the decision of Auckland Council, that it has come about through discussions between the ministers and Prime Minister who are part of the coronavirus or COVID-19 committee, and that it is based on information that we have received from different government agencies. So, along with Auckland Council and the Mayor, we are sad that this decision had to be made, but we think that it is the responsible decision, and our primary consideration has to be for our neighbours, the Pacific countries themselves, and that is the basis of this decision.
Thank you very much. Unless any councillors want to make a comment, we'll just open it up for questions.
When you talk about things may yet change in Auckland, what things are you considering at this stage? What things are you bottling? What predictions have you got?
Well, the government, of course, which has the overall responsibility for the whole of the country, including Auckland, has a pandemic contingency plan that would be put into place. So they would be making the big decisions. And what I've been very pleased at is the very proactive stance by Ashley Bloomfield, Director General of Health, and the government in anticipating rather than waiting for developments, and I think that is important. Here in Council, we've put in place our own provisions, particularly in relation to staffing matters and staff that may have a common cold or may have ordinary influenza, for example. You can't really tell the difference at the early stages from the symptoms, are told to stay at home and to work from home. We've lifted the levels of advice and hygiene within the building. So you'll see the hand sanitisers, you'll see paper towels in the restrooms. We have lifted the level of cleaning in public places and through organisations such as Auckland Transport. But if need be, all of those measures can and will be ramped up should there be a wider spread of the COVID-19 in the community. At this point, we are very satisfied that the spread of the disease has been constrained, but even with the best measures in the world, we've seen countries that have suffered far more infections and fatalities that we haven't seen yet in this country. But we need to be, and my understanding from health authorities, we are ready in that instance.
So what are you looking at in Auckland? Are you looking at closures, no more concerts?
No. What I've said, and I'll repeat it because it's quite important. We are judging the public gatherings on an event-by-event basis. The health authorities' advice, which we put great store by, continues to be that the risk of infection at such gatherings is extraordinarily low. But if there is a particular situation such as this one where there are other considerations to take into account, such as if there is an infection, and because there is a large number of people coming from the Pacific to this event and it's carried back to their countries, what would be the impact on the region? And we are not prepared to take that risk with the disastrous consequences that would follow.
I suppose my question was, are you looking at big ticket items in the future, the possibility of
If the situation were to deteriorate and there were to be people-to-people transmission across the community, yes, then of course we would look at events in the community, and the government would be looking at things like attendance at school or health authorities. I want to stress, because I'm not here to induce panic, that we have not reached that point, and we hope not to reach it. But should there be contingency plans in place? Of course.
The Prime Minister received advice earlier this week, I think on Tuesday, from health officials, and was told that big events like the Pacifica Festival and Memorial Service in Christchurch could go ahead.
Yes.
What has changed exactly between Tuesday and now?
Well, I'll invite
Sure.
Minister Sepuloni to talk to that, because she is on the Cabinet Committee.
So the health advice stands in terms of large-scale events still being able to go ahead as long as the public health messages are put out there and all of those types of guidelines are followed. The difference with this event is that MB advice indicated the large number of people that were likely to be in attendance from the Pacific and therefore travelling back to the Pacific. And the large nature of the event, keeping in mind that Pacifica would have been the biggest event held in New Zealand this weekend, with around 60,000 plus people attending, would have meant that contact tracing would have been incredibly difficult, and then also if someone was to attend and it was caught and taken to the Pacific, it would be detrimental potentially, and so that is the difference. We of course accept Ministry of Health advice, but we have advice coming from other agencies as well, and the MB advice on this was integral to the decision that we've made today.
It seems like quite a drastic decision considering the threat of community transmission remains low.
We don't want any regrets, and as the Mayor has said, it is for all of us, quite heartbreaking that we've had to make this decision, but the call had to be made. We know the challenges in the Pacific in terms of the resourcing and the health infrastructure in general, and we also know the challenges in terms of the health conditions that our Pacific people in Pacific nations are more susceptible to or have higher proportions of, including things like diabetes. And so it makes those populations much more vulnerable, and we don't want to be in a position where we're hosting an event here that could lead to the spread of coronavirus to the Pacific region.
All that considered, looking forward to next weekend with Polyfest, has there been any advice you've received or you've received about that?
We are still talking about what may occur in regard to Polyfest. I think the key difference is that we believe that it's much more likely to be a local event rather than an event with people coming here from the Pacific. But we are still considering advice. We are determining whether there will be any international attendance at that event, and we have yet to talk to the organisers of the event. But that is due to take place next Wednesday, so there is some urgency in the advice that we're seeking on Polyfest itself. Can I just stress, in backing up what Minister Sepuloni has just said, yes, we are being precautionary here, and I think when I talked to the Consul General from Samoa, Fa'olotoi Pongi, he used just those words. Yeah, it's better to be precautionary than to run the risk in this event. And Samoa certainly understands, and Samoa is taking quite strong measures of its own to ensure that this infection does not repeat the tragedy of last year with the measles epidemic.
What other conversations have you had with the Pacific government? Any other formal requests
I'll get Carmel again to talk about governments.
So I have spoken directly to the Samoan High Commissioner, who is also the head of the Diplomatic Corps. High Commissioner Leasi Scanlon, he supports our decision here for the reasons that we've outlined. Also, we have spoken to some health professionals, so I think including probably the leading Pacific public health professional, which is Dr. Colin Tukuitonga, and also the Chief Executive of the county's Manukau DHB. And at this very moment, the Ministry of Pacific Peoples is having a meeting in Manukau with a room of health professionals from the Pacific sector as well. So there has been a number of conversations had.
A question I'm not sure if I'd like to answer for now. Te Kara, their friends who couldn't be here, but with Māori and Pacific often suffering so badly in the health statistics, any advice for them during all this?
That may be something for central government.
Yeah, I mean, the advice that's being put out there publicly, the public health advice is what stands. It is the need to ensure that we wash our hands, the need to limit contact, which can be very hard for our Māori and Pacific communities when you see each other and are so used to greeting each other, whether it be with a hongi or kissing each other hello. But we are trying to take leadership as well in these situations and encourage people to greet each other in different ways. And so those are some of the messages that we need to be continuing to put out to all New Zealanders, including Māori and Pacific. Yeah.
And can I just add to that? For our Māori and Pacifica families, communities, we don't go to the doctors, we don't seek any medical attention when we don't feel well. And so this is just a reminder that if you are not feeling well, ring the Healthline number, ring your doctor, get some advice and follow it up. Just don't sit on it. Yeah, and stay home. But do something because as the statistics show, we are the most vulnerable in terms of health and well-being outcomes.
Sorry, can I just ask about Polyfest again? Just because you've cancelled Pacifica, but Polyfest is such a way bigger event, and it's like 90 to 100,000 people coming to the event.
Yeah.
And I do know, because you said, Mayor, that you don't know international groups are coming, but there are some from Hawaii, Tahiti, and Canada. So I'm just wondering whether
This was the advice we were waiting.
Yeah. That's exactly the advice that we're seeking at the moment, and we need to have discussions with the organisers before. This is not a case of making a unilateral decision. We need to talk to the organisers of that event, and we need to ascertain the levels of risk, including transmission back to the Pacific. Those are important factors.
So can you guarantee at this stage that Polyfest will go ahead?
No, of course not, for the reasons that I've just given. We have not yet got all the facts that we need to make an informed decision on that. We have not yet talked to the organisers, but the decision that we make, you can be sure, will be a decision that puts the health and safety of people at the forefront of our decision making.
This is the second year in a row that this
Yeah.
event has been cancelled. Have you spoken to groups, members of the community who are involved, and how are they feeling?
We've talked, Councillor Filipina has been talking to some of our hardworking people in ATEED that have spent the last several days setting up in preparation for the event. And there's a huge disappointment there, but I think an understanding of why the decision has to be made. Right across Auckland, you know, the 60,000 of us that turn up, and I turn up every year, and all my colleagues up here at the event, it's hugely disappointing for us. It's an event that we love. It's a celebration of something that's special about Auckland. But these are special times, as was last year. And last year, it was with huge reluctance that, on police advice, that we cancelled. On this time, it's taking all of into account everything that needs to be taken into account, weighing against our simple desire to have an event that we can celebrate and enjoy. And I think, you know, and the people that I have talked to since we've reached this decision, there is an understanding that we have to be precautionary and that we have to put health and safety concerns first in this instance. These are special times, unprecedented times.
And can I just add, from a Pacifica community perspective, we understood the reasons for cancelling last year out of respect for our Muslim community. And this year, we are going to understand the reasons why this has been cancelled. We do know that there's disappointment because it is such short notice, and there are already people that have flown over here from overseas to sell their things at Pacifica. But again, the reasons are completely understandable.
I've asked that question. I haven't yet been given a figure, but whatever the figure is, money was never going to prevail over the health and well-being of all of our people. Okay, I think we've probably reached the end of questions. Thank you very much for coming along today. Cheers. Right. Thank you very much, guys.
He paused. Some person stole my car. Seriously, the woman said. Wow, that sucks. Yep, he said. What was it? The guy still looking down at his invoices as he spoke. What was it? The guy still looking down at his invoices as he spoke. Was. A Subaru, he said. Legacy, wagon. Yeah, the man said, raising his head to look at him now.